Hi, I'm Alexandra Nicholas-Kuhn, Executive Director for the Massillon Museum. Thank you for tuning in to view our monthly Brown Bag Lunch lecture series. During this current health crisis, the Massillon Museum is closed to the public, but you can stay informed of all our program updates by visiting massillonmuseum.org/COVID-19 or following our Facebook page, and there is ample opportunity to stay connected by way of all our social media channels, not only Facebook, but Instagram and Twitter as well. So make sure you check in frequently and stay connected to your Massillon Museum. It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you a gentleman I have known for many years since having started my career at the Massillon Museum, and who many of you likely know or have heard speak, my good friend, MJ Albacete. He will be speaking today on the central figures of the Stark County Courthouse Pediment, which many of you are likely familiar with. The beauty of that pediment and its history you'll learn about in just a few short moments. But to tell you a little bit about MJ, he retired from his career as director of the Canton Museum of Art after a quarter of a century of leadership. He's also revered as an art scholar, music reviewer, college educator, writer, photographer, world traveler, and public speaker. Often called a Renaissance man, his knowledge spans a myriad of cultural subjects, history and architecture topping the list. I hope you enjoyed today's program. Thanks so much for MCTV for making it available to you, our members of the community and our supporters.
Of the 88 county courthouses in the state of Ohio, at least half of them carry an external architectural detail called a pediment, most often found on these buildings predating the 20th century. The pediment first appears as a prominent element in ancient Greek temple architecture. That's the wide triangular space that crowns the temple facade. The term's derived from the Latin word pedis, for foot, since the projecting ledge was deep enough to accommodate large statues of prominent Greek gods and goddesses, mortals and even animals arranged in various postures. A few excellent examples survive from antiquity, specifically the pediments found at each end of the 5th century BCE Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. Unfortunately, only a few broken statuary fragments remain in place of the severely damaged temple. Americans can go to Nashville, Tennessee, and see a total recreation of the Parthenon from the 1928 Tennessee Centennial, where there was a full recreation of the original Parthenon, including freestanding sculptures of the pediment. The Nashville Parthenon is from the classical period, and any Greek citizen walking around the Parthenon could identify the action taking place high above their heads in the 100-foot wide pediment. Athena challenges Poseidon for possession of the Attic land, and she wins. Of course, on the opposite side, there was another pediment, the birth of Athena, and I invite you to visit Nashville to see this marvelous structure. Later on, temple pediments of the Roman period were generally graced with relief sculptures more or less bound to the back wall or the tympanum, and by association with the Roman code of law and the civil and religious authority represented by their temples, later government institutions frequently made use of the pediment on their buildings, usually with their own symbolic representations. Here in Ohio, we can see evidence of this in a modest number of examples of our county courthouses, kindly provided for us by Attorney David Dingwell, who has set himself the task of recording every one of them in beautiful, full-color, high-resolution photographs that we're using here. Let's look at a few, and in this case, this is the Butler County Courthouse of 1885, and you can see a pediment right in the middle of the facade. This is the Clark County Courthouse of 1924, not exactly a pediment, and yet we can still see evidences of the scales of justice and the fasces, the banded rushes, and the axes that you see on both sides of this installation. The Guernsey County Courthouse of 1884, Harrison, 1895, Lorain County, 1881, Ross County, 1858, Wyandotte County in 1900, Henry County, 1880, and of course, the Stark County Courthouse. All above being true, the Stark County citizens should be proud of the fact that our courthouse has the distinction of being the only one in the state of Ohio with a fully sculpted pediment. While several of its figures are symbolic, there are also direct sculptural associations with the vital economic and industrial forces that nurtured our community. In the early 1890s, the Stark County Commissioners came to the realization that the existing courthouse, just over 20 years old, no longer adequately answered the needs of the growing community. Still, much of the existing structure was quite serviceable, so the solution fulfilled by their architect of choice, George F. Hammond of Cleveland, was to construct a new enlarged courthouse wrapped around the core of the old one. Hammond sensibly retained certain architectural details of the former 1868-1870 Italianate style, incorporated into his own Beaux-Arts interpretation. After the completion of the Stark County Courthouse in 1895, passers-by walking along the Tuscarawas Avenue facade could look up in wonder at the tall clock-faced bell tower with its 4 trumpeters of justice, and just below that, a monumental symbolic pediment worthy of an ancient Greek temple. The motivation to make use of classical details, particularly Roman influences, goes back to Thomas Jefferson, who during a visit to France was impressed with the stateliness of such buildings and was particularly impressed by the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, France, as well as the Lex Romana, the Roman code of laws. We see this influence manifested in various government buildings in our nation's capital and throughout the entire United States. Our attention is drawn to one specific Greco-Roman architectural detail, and that is the triangular space on the temple front called the pediment. I want to show you a few examples of these just to make my point. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. has a number of pediments if you know where to look. This is the one called the Genius of America. It is the oldest of the various sculptural pediments on Washington, D.C. buildings, and it features 3 figures representing America: justice, and hope. The original sandstone version was done by Italian sculptor Luigi Persico, representing the figures of peace, plenty, and Hercules, and was installed on the east entrance of the Capitol, such as it was in 1825 and 1828. At the suggestion of President John Quincy Adams, Hercules, which seemed out of place here, the ancient symbol of power, was replaced by hope. When modifications and enlargements were made to this part of the Capitol buildings in the 1950s, Persico's severely deteriorated pediment was replaced by a relatively exact copy by American sculptor Bruno Mankowski in 1959 and 60. Although the whole pediment measures 81.5 feet, the 3 figures, 9 feet tall, dominate only the central space, about 18 feet wide. On the east front of the Senate building of the U.S. Capitol, we find the Progress of Civilization, which features figures representing the early days of America, along with the diversity of human endeavor. The sculpture was executed in marble by American artist Thomas Crawford in 1893. That full pediment measures 80 feet, but the actual sculptured portion 60 feet long, 12 feet high. At this point, it is worth noting that the dimensions of the pediment of the Stark County Courthouse are exactly equal in size. On the east front of the House building, we find the Apotheosis of Democracy, an allegorical group of peace-protecting genius with figures representing 2 great sources of wealth, industry and agriculture. It was created in marble by Paul Wayland Bartlett in 1916. The sculptured portion of the pediment measures 60 feet long, 12 feet high. And the west pediment of the Supreme Court building, carved by Robert I. Aiken and set in place in 1932-33. The central figures represent order, liberty enthroned, and authority. But where does the story of the Stark County Courthouse pediment actually begin? And who was the sculptor of this fine work of art? His name was buried for years in the historic records until researchers Tom Hawes and Mark Holland at the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum spent hours searching online through decades of old Canton repository archives and rediscovered the elusive master. Whoever came up with the concept, the various representations depicted on the pediment, the credit for the finished product must go to the remarkable talents of James G.C. Hamilton of Cleveland. According to artists in Ohio, Hamilton was an American sculptor active in Cleveland, Ohio from about 1887 to 1898 and said to be a graduate of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Nationally famous, his catalog of many notable sculptural works include the statue of General Moses Cleveland, erected in Cleveland's public square in 1888, and a monumental Christ on the Cross in a Roman Catholic cemetery in Albany, New York. Well, the Sunday Times Magazine section of October 19, 1902, describes a major new commission for this sculptor to create a quantity of figures for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. However, there is no evidence, to the best of my knowledge and research, that Hamilton completed any work at all at St. John's, no doubt the victim of one of the many financial crises that have plagued the cathedral, which remains unfinished to this day. But however many sculptures Hamilton may have completed in his lifetime, of various figures and themes, large and small, the evidence seems to indicate quite clearly that he sculpted only one pediment, and a spectacular one at that, and that is the one we have right here on the Stark County Courthouse. On February 14, 1894, the Cleveland Leader newspaper published a picture of the model for the handsome pediment, which will adorn the new courthouse at Canton in the studio of J.G.C. Hamilton. According to the article, the pediment will be over the second story. The pediment will be of Berea sandstone, 64 feet long and 12 feet high at the apex. In the solid stone will be carved the bas-relief, many beautiful figures. Work on the pediment, which will cost $4,000, will be commenced in about a month, at the earliest March or April of that year. Together, we must assume that the sculptor and the architect must have planned the actual design of the pediment sculptures, no doubt with input from county officials familiar with the community history. Such a gigantic undertaking causes us to wonder where the pediment was actually sculpted, in Cleveland or here in Canton on the ground, or in a scaffold in situ. There appears to be no record of the process, but my guess is that it was sculpted in Cleveland in various sections, carefully packed and transported to Canton, and piece by piece lifted into place sometime during 1894 and 1895. In fact, I had the opportunity quite a few years ago to share a ride with Scott Heckel, photographer for the repository, on one of Steve Kuhn's cherry pickers to view the pediment close up, and we could make out more than 30 individual pieces, individual blocks. You'll see some of the lines in our series of pictures. Here is the actual spread of the Stark County Courthouse pediment, and for this photograph and all the detail shots to follow, I again express my sincere thanks to David Dingwell, who took these excellent photos from a 6th or 7th story window across the street at the First National Bank building. We might describe the sculptural technique used here as high relief. Low relief would mean that the figures were only superficially sculpted in the wall behind, which we would call a tympanum, perhaps to the depth of only a few inches. But here the figures are cut much deeper and are more three-dimensional, certain elements actually projecting out of the surface, in some cases fully sculpted in the round, as we will see in several instances. Dominating the central vignette of the pediment are the figures of 4 women in various poses, symbolically represented in flowing Roman robes. The central figure, representing Justice, stands on a 2-step pedestal, placing her higher but no larger than the 3 other figures. This is intended to stress her greater importance in this context. Her extended right arm holds the scales of justice, balancing out innocence or guilt. Her left holds the hilt of a sword, typifying equity and execution. She is blind as we might expect, standing upright in a dramatic contrapposto pose, her left leg hidden, her right leg exposed, stepping forward. Her head is carved fully in the round and reaches up to the very peak of the pediment. She is crowned with a laurel wreath representing her authority. Near the tip of the sword there is an open book upon which bears the single Latin word lex, signifying the book of the law. Behind her is a wide throne with 2 other books and an owl perched on the left arm. We'll see these in greater detail in a moment. The steeply angled sides of the pediment often pose difficult challenges to Greek sculptors as to how to deal with such restricted spaces. In Greek pediments, the gods were centrally located, full scale. Mere mortals were placed on either side, diminished in size, or forced to kneel or lie down, or the tight space given over to objects or animals. Here, our sculptor has ideal solutions on each side, departing from the obvious symbolism of the central group to historic fact. Far to the left, forming a perfect angular arrangement, we see a farmer bending over to attach a plow to two horses, an obvious tribute to Stark County's initial importance in agriculture and the manufacture of farming equipment distributed nationwide. Joshua Gibbs plows in 1832, and the reapers by Ball, Altman and Company in 1851. So exactly whose plow is this one? Well, according to local historian Richard Haldy, the plow reproduced in the pediment resembles any of the several manufactured by companies in our area. They all look very much alike. There were 3 Canton plow companies that sold throughout the world. Joshua Gibbs Plow Company in 1832, later the more prominent Butcher and Gibbs Company. There was also George and Charles Cook of the Princess Plow and the Universal Plow Company. These plow manufacturers, along with Ball, Altman and Company in 1851 and their reapers, were a significant part of what made early Stark County a major American center for agricultural equipment in the late 19th century. Haldy provided us with some images very recently of some of the plows that were advertised. And you can see of the 3 different types here, they do all look very, very much alike. I felt compelled to give the horses a full image of their own, since it recalled to me the many horses to be found on the ancient Parthenon frieze in similar poses and similarly overlaid. But here, the one in front is carved full length in much greater detail and depth, the foreleg fully in the round. Moving across the pediment from left to right, we next encounter 3 of the 4 symbolic figures who are the focus of our study. Left is commerce, center is justice, right is agriculture. Study this arrangement for a few moments because we will next take closer looks at each of them one at a time. But note here and in the next view closer up the distinct lines which mark off the 30 sections which make up the full pediment. Note too, the left figure mirrors the pose of the figure opposite. Here we see commerce in a very comfortable, relaxed pose, her left foot resting on the first step of the pedestal. She is identified by 2 of her attributes, her left arm laid across a world globe, signifying the worldwide distribution of farm products made in Stark County at that time. Near her right foot is a bag of coins, representing the wealth brought into the community through its industry and agriculture, symbols of Stark County's early successes in national and international markets. A closer view of commerce, her head and torso, reveals that her eyes are wide open and intense, staring out at us. Could these 4 women have been modeled on real people? We just don't know. A medallion of some sort holds together the straps on her garment, and near her left foot, we see the bag of coins spilling out. Next comes Justice, whom we have already met, but keeping her in context as we move across the pediment. A close-up showing the similarity of her garment and the fact that her eyes are blind. At her side is a long sword, almost fully sculpted, the 3 books of the law, the clawfoot of her throne with the head of some fantastic animal. What is the symbolism of this strange animal? We don't know, but the owl we do. There he is in a rather peculiar little creature. But in ancient Greek symbolism, he is pretty important. He represents wisdom. We come now to agriculture, identified by her 2 attributes, the rake in her left hand and the sickle in her right. She mirrors the pose of her sister, Commerce, on the other side, with her right foot on the pedestal. Unlike her sister, she seems to be staring off into space. The object lower right does not belong to her, but to the next figure over. But one oddity remains to be explained about agriculture. She is wearing some kind of an apron, perhaps leather, to protect her from flying sparks as she sharpens tools or pounds red-hot metal. And look at the intense expression on her eyes and face. Industry seems focused on her work, her left hand holding a hammer which rests on an anvil. Her right hand holds a pair of calipers, and behind her is a large cogwheel or flywheel or a large gear. And that mysterious object lower left, identified in some places as a stack of rope. And that mysterious object that we're identifying, which in fact it may be, or it may be braided straw, but it is more than that. It is really a skep or beehive. The skep is capped by a removable lid to allow human hands access to the combs of honey inside. Note the small hole for the bees at the very bottom. Of course, a beehive is the perfect representation of industrious activity. And at last, we arrive at the angle at the far right on the pediment where we see two merino sheep, a ram standing and a ewe at rest, cleverly making best use of the space. These two sheep serve to remind spectators on the sidewalk far below of the flock of Spanish sheep imported and bred for their superior wool by Thomas and Charity Roch of Massillon, supplying markets in the textile industries. So now you know the full story of the Stark County Pediment, but we must spend a few moments to comment on another unique feature of the courthouse, the four trumpeters of justice high atop the clock and bell tower. In the 1990s, the condition of the 140-foot courthouse clock and bell tower was such that a substantial rebuilding and restoration was deemed essential, and the four trumpeters of justice were carefully removed and placed in a temporary storage area. During their absence, the four figures received essential restoration at another site, and after a long delay, were finally returned to their former position high overhead. Spectators gathered downtown as each trumpeter slowly descended to the ground well over a century since they were lifted into place in 1895. It was a most unusual sight to see the bell tower decapitated. The creator of the trumpeters was long attributed to John Sigismund of the W.H. Mullins Art Metals work of Salem, but according to Kelly Woodward of the Woodward Video Productions, aided by Tom Hawes and the Salem Historical Society, some doubt was raised about this attribution. According to documentation provided by the Salem Historical Society, Sigismund did not start working there until 1896, a year after the completion of the courthouse. Or, Kelly suggests, it is possible that the trumpeters were installed somewhat later. Otherwise, Alphonse Peltzer is the more likely sculptor based on the dates. Tom also found an article stating that the original statues were supposed to be male, not female, and identified as Gabriel. The article was found in the Evening Repository for Thursday, April 5th, 1894, and I have to quote that at length. Gabriel is here. The county commissioners have a new photograph said to be a picture of Gabriel. The commissioners think they will want 4 of him to place one at each corner of the new courthouse tower. He is to be made of bronze or copper and be about 9 feet high. The photograph represents him to be a young man with very little clothing, whose only occupation apparently is to blow a long, slender tin horn. The youngster is furnished with a pair of stout-looking wings, but the commissioners say he will not be allowed to fly around, but will be nailed down to his little corner of the tower. Each statue actually is over 11 feet, weighing approximately 450 pounds, made of 24-gauge copper. They stand in a contrapposto pose, which means one foot revealed and the other hidden away. And in this case, we see them loaded on a flatbed truck to be delivered to the area where they will be repaired. One of them will be placed in the courtyard of the Cultural Center for the Arts, where many visitors came to have their photograph taken holding the extended hand of one of the trumpeters and having an opportunity to see close-up details that cannot be seen from far down on the street. At a request from the Canton Museum of Art, Diane Belfiglio created a stunning painting of one of the trumpeters in pastel medium, released in a limited edition. The original was acquired by the Bicentennial Committee and is now permanently installed in the Stark County Courthouse, where it properly belongs. The tower reconstruction and replacement of the 4 trumpeters was completed in 2003, and a rededication ceremony took place at the courthouse on October 30, 2003. And the next time you are in downtown Canton, or even make a special trip, you can take a few moments to pause in front of the south entrance and direct your eyes up to the big triangle and the clock tower overhead. I do suggest, however, that you avoid being struck by vehicles moving east and west on Tuscarawas Street. You cross to the sidewalk on the opposite side for the best and safest view. Take along a pair of binoculars to see the details, and invite some of your younger folks in your sphere of influence to go along with you to experience an important example of Stark County history. Mark R. Warner, for many years the court administrator for the Stark County Court of Common Pleas, points out that other fascinating details about Hamilton's pediment sculpture in his fascinating History of the Stark County Courthouse. Mr. Warner's 13-page article may be accessed via Google by entering the title. I'm indebted to him for some of the content of this article.